The Galactic Empire had been stretched thin for years, fighting off rebellions in multiple star systems. But the latest rebellion on the remote world of Erythra X9 was proving to be the breaking point. For months, Imperial forces had been engaged in a drawn-out battle against a coalition of planetary militias, but the resistance kept growing stronger, more coordinated. Every attempt to crush them had failed, leaving the Empire in a state of desperation. The Empire's leadership, usually confident in its might, was now facing the possibility of a humiliating defeat. This rebellion wasn't like the others. The insurgents weren't just fighting for freedom. They were fighting to expose the cracks in the Empire's control across the galaxy. They had proven capable of striking at Imperial supply lines, sabotaging communication systems, and even bringing down major fleets. With each victory, they gathered more supporters. The Empire needed something drastic, something beyond conventional warfare. That was when the Empire's top military strategist, Admiral Varric, proposed an option that no one in the Imperial Council had wanted to consider: the hiring of mercenaries. Mercenaries were known for their efficiency, but also for their brutal tactics and lack of loyalty. Still, Varric had no choice. He couldn't afford another failure, especially after the crushing losses that had already occurred. The decision was made quickly. The Empire would reach out to Thorne, a name that had earned fear across the galaxy. Thorne was a mercenary commander who led a private army with no allegiances other than to the highest bidder. He was ruthless, efficient, and known for his unmatched skill in eradicating any resistance, no matter how well organized or well equipped they were. Thorne's reputation was built on the backs of countless destroyed worlds and millions of lives, a legacy of violence that made him an invaluable asset to anyone willing to pay the price. The Empire didn't care about the morality of his methods. They only needed results. Thorne's mercenaries could bring the rebellion to its knees. Varric contacted Thorne directly, bypassing the usual channels to make sure the message was clear. The mercenary leader's reply was swift and straightforward. "Name the price," Thorne said. The deal was struck within hours. As the mercenaries began their deployment, the Empire's military command grew increasingly anxious. Despite their willingness to rely on a third-party army, there was no guarantee the mercenaries would follow Imperial orders or treat the insurgents with the kind of ruthlessness needed to crush them. But there was no time for second-guessing. The rebellion was gaining strength too fast, and the Empire needed immediate results. While the Galactic Empire waited for the mercenaries to make their move, a different dynamic was unfolding on Erythra X9. The Resistance, despite their many setbacks, had found a ray of hope in an unexpected source. They had sent a desperate message to Earth, hoping that the intergalactic power from the distant star system would lend them aid. Earth, however, had largely stayed neutral in galactic politics. It had no interest in engaging in the larger conflicts of the galaxy, until now. The message from Erythra X9 had sparked a decision in Earth's high command. If the Empire could not be stopped, the galaxy would fall further into tyranny. And so, Earth's response was to activate a project they had kept secret for years. The Juggernaut. The Juggernaut wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of Earth's strength, a towering behemoth capable of turning the tide of any war. This wasn't a simple ship or army. The Juggernaut was a war machine unlike anything seen before, indestructible, autonomous, and powered by technology that Earth had developed in isolation. While the mercenaries took to the battlefield, moving swiftly to engage the rebellion, the Juggernaut began its preparations. This wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about sending a message to the Empire. The Juggernaut would show the galaxy that Earth wasn't a distant, insignificant power anymore. They were here to stay, and they would fight. The mercenaries, unaware of Earth's looming involvement, moved into position. Their arrival on Erythra X9 was swift and calculated. Thorne's forces were not here to negotiate or to bargain. They were here to annihilate. The mercenary army made quick work of the outer defenses of the rebellion, showcasing the kind of ruthless efficiency they were known for. Resistance fighters were slaughtered with no remorse, and the world seemed to be on the brink of total collapse. Yet, deep within the rebellion, a core group of leaders had something more in mind than simply holding off Thorne's forces for as long as they could. They believed they could win, not through brute force, but by using the enemy's strengths against them. They would buy time, regroup, and counterattack with a weapon far beyond anything Thorne could anticipate. The resistance didn't know when or how, but they were determined to find a way. Thorne's arrival on the planet was like a storm. His army spread across the surface, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. The mercenaries were efficient, organized, and methodical in their destruction, cutting down resistance fighters and taking control of key strategic locations. Yet, even as victory seemed certain, there was an unsettling feeling among the Empire's officers. Thorne's forces were too perfect, too cold in their efficiency. They had not reckoned with the Resistance's heart, nor the desperation driving them to fight beyond the limits of reason. As Thorne surveyed the carnage, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The Resistance should have been broken by now. They had no resources, no way to defend against his firepower. Yet they were still fighting, still holding their ground. He smiled to himself, thinking of the price the Empire was paying for this mercenary force. Every victory would come at a cost. But as Thorne's thoughts drifted toward the spoils of war, something even more significant was happening elsewhere. Deep beneath the surface of Erythra X9, hidden from both the mercenaries and the Empire, Earth's ultimate weapon was preparing for deployment. The Juggernaut was on its way. The arrival of the Juggernaut would change the balance of power in ways no one could predict. The Resistance had unknowingly placed their faith in a weapon far beyond Thorne's mercenary army. The Juggernaut was not just a weapon of destruction, it was a symbol of the struggle for freedom, of the desire to stand up against the tyranny of the Empire. But for now, it remained a secret, quietly building the tension between those who thought they controlled the galaxy, and those who had only just begun to realize the scale of their own power. The galaxy was on the cusp of a new era, one where Earth's shadow would loom large over the Imperial forces. And with it, the fate of Erythra X9 hung in the balance. The Juggernaut was more than a weapon. It was Earth's answer to the growing influence of the Galactic Empire, a force built in secret over decades. For years, Earth's governments had watched from the sidelines as the Empire expanded its control over the galaxy. Despite the Empire's power, Earth had remained neutral, reluctant to get entangled in intergalactic conflicts. But the situation on Erythra X9 was different. The Empire's relentless pursuit of its goals had pushed the galaxy to the edge, and Earth could no longer afford to remain passive. The Juggernaut had been conceived as a deterrent, a project that would tip the balance of power in Earth's favor if the need ever arose. It was a colossal, sentient war machine, designed to be unstoppable. Powered by an advanced fusion reactor and reinforced by a near-impenetrable armor, the Juggernaut was capable of surviving in extreme conditions, including the vacuum of space and the depths of hostile planets. Its design was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, a perfect fusion of human ingenuity and artificial intelligence. Its mind, though artificial, was sophisticated enough to adapt to any combat situation, making it more than just a tool of destruction. It was a strategic asset, a weapon that could learn and evolve. The Juggernaut's development had been kept under wraps, known only to a select few within Earth's military-industrial complex. The project's primary goal had always been to ensure Earth's security in a galaxy that was increasingly being dominated by more powerful empires. When the Resistance on Erythra X9 sent their plea for help, Earth's High Command knew that the time had come to reveal the Juggernaut's existence. The machine, built to destroy entire fleets, would be deployed to tip the scales in favor of the Resistance, and by extension, Earth's influence. The deployment wasn't without its complications. The Juggernaut was not simply a weapon, it was also a sentinel, designed to protect its pilot as much as it was to annihilate enemies. Its artificial intelligence had been designed to interact with its operator, forming a bond that was both intellectual and emotional. The pilot, chosen for their unique skills and unshakable resolve, would need to integrate with the machine, guiding it through complex combat scenarios. But the relationship between the pilot and the Juggernaut was not without challenges. The machine's intelligence was vast, sometimes surpassing the pilot's own capabilities. It could anticipate threats, make decisions in the heat of battle, and adapt faster than any human could. The Juggernaut's pilot was Captain Elena Rook, a seasoned veteran who had spent years in Earth's military. Rook was known for her tactical brilliance, having led countless operations on Earth's most hostile terrains. She was a leader, but also a survivor, someone who had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer. Her connection to the Juggernaut was both her greatest strength and her most daunting challenge. The machine's vast intellect and her own human instincts sometimes clashed, forcing Rook to reconcile her decisions with the Juggernaut's predictions. Rook had never been fully comfortable with the idea of commanding a weapon so powerful. It was one thing to lead soldiers into battle, but commanding a nearly indestructible machine that could wipe out entire armies with ease was something else entirely. Yet she understood the stakes. If Earth didn't intervene, the Empire would tighten its grip on the galaxy, and resistance movements like the one on Erythra X9 would be crushed. Earth's intervention wasn't just about saving a rebellion. It was about preserving a future where Earth had a seat at the table of galactic powers. As the Juggernaut was activated, its systems powered up, and Rook began the delicate process of synchronizing with it. The machine hummed to life, its core coming online and illuminating with a cold, calculating glow. The artificial intelligence that governed the Juggernaut's actions scanned Rook, analyzing her every thought, every reflex, every decision she made. The machine didn't just respond to commands, it anticipated them. Rook was a crucial part of the equation, but the Juggernaut was in many ways its own entity. It had its own understanding of tactics, and its own view of the battlefield. For Rook, the experience was overwhelming at first. She had always relied on her instincts in battle, but the Juggernaut's precision and calculated approach forced her to think differently. Every movement, every action, was analyzed by the machine, and Rook could feel the weight of its intelligence on her shoulders. There were moments when she questioned whether she was truly in control, or if the Juggernaut had already begun to chart its own course. Despite the unease she felt, Rook also realized the power at her disposal. The Juggernaut could tear through enemy lines with ease, its massive frame cutting through armor like a hot knife through butter. It could level entire cities in a single strike. And yet, the machine was also capable of subtlety. It could adapt to any situation, whether it was a large-scale battle or a covert strike. It was a weapon of pure destruction, but it could also be a tool for precision, tailored to whatever the mission demanded. Rook knew that the Juggernaut's true strength lay in its unpredictability. The machine's ability to learn and evolve in the midst of battle made it a terrifying opponent for anyone who stood in its way. Thorne and his mercenaries, while formidable, were nothing compared to the Juggernaut. Their weapons, their tactics, would be useless against something that could not only predict their moves but adapt to them. While Rook prepared for deployment, the situation on Erythra X9 was growing more desperate. The Resistance had been holding out against the mercenaries for weeks, but they were on the brink of collapse. Thorne's forces were closing in, and the Resistance had no means of defending themselves. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. Earth's intervention was their last hope. Rook's journey to Erythra X9 was quick but fraught with tension. She had no illusions about what awaited her. The Juggernaut was meant to be a game-changer, but even with such power, there was no guarantee of success. The Empire had powerful fleets and experienced commanders. But Earth's arrival was already changing the dynamic. The Resistance, upon learning of the Juggernaut's arrival, began to rally. They saw it as a symbol of Earth's commitment to the cause, a sign that they weren't alone in their struggle. As Rook landed on Erythra X9 and initiated the first phase of the Juggernaut's combat operation, she felt a surge of energy course through her. The machine was ready, and so was she. Together, they would face Thorne's mercenaries and change the course of the war. The battle for the galaxy was just beginning. But Earth, with its Juggernaut, was no longer on the sidelines. Thorne's mercenaries had been deployed across Erythra X9 for weeks. Their initial strikes had been swift and brutal, decimating the Resistance forces that dared to challenge the Empire's might. The mercenaries, trained for total warfare, knew how to break a system, to crush morale and dismantle resistance with ruthless efficiency. They had done it countless times before, and they were certain this rebellion would fall the same way. But as the days wore on, Thorne's confidence began to waver. The insurgents on Erythra X9 were different. They weren't just resisting, they were holding ground, regrouping, and showing a resilience that Thorne hadn't anticipated. It was clear that his forces, while formidable, were facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered. The resistance, though smaller, fought with an intensity that suggested they had something more than desperation on their side. Even more unsettling was their organization. They weren't simply disjointed factions fighting for survival. They had been meticulously coordinated, their movements timed, their strategies precise. It was as if someone had planned every move, anticipating Thorne's tactics before they were even set into motion. As the resistance mounted a counterattack, the tide seemed to be shifting. The mercenaries, despite their strength and firepower, were struggling to maintain control. Thorne, usually calm in the face of chaos, found himself questioning the situation. His forces were slowly being pushed back, and every victory came at a higher cost. The usual quick and decisive wins had turned into long, drawn-out battles. The cost in both lives and resources was mounting, and there was no sign of the resistance's resolve weakening. But what truly unsettled Thorne was the arrival of a new, unexpected player. The Juggernaut had entered the conflict. At first, its presence was just a rumor, whispers of a powerful, seemingly indestructible force that was somehow changing the dynamic of the war. Thorne dismissed it as exaggerated propaganda, a desperate attempt to rally the morale of a dying rebellion. He was wrong. As more reports came in, it became clear that the Juggernaut wasn't a myth. It was real. And it was unlike anything he had ever faced. The Juggernaut was not just a machine, it was an evolving entity, a force of nature that could adapt and outmaneuver anything thrown its way. It was designed to be invincible, but it was also intelligent. The sheer size of the Juggernaut alone made it an overwhelming presence on the battlefield. Its speed, despite its massive frame, was unnerving. What truly set it apart from anything Thorne had encountered was its ability to anticipate and respond to enemy tactics in real time. It wasn't just following orders, it was making its own decisions, altering its approach based on the situation, evolving as the battle unfolded. The mercenaries had encountered heavily fortified positions before, but never anything like this. They had been trained to exploit weaknesses, to hit where the enemy was vulnerable. But the Juggernaut had no obvious weak points. Its armor was nearly impenetrable, and its weapon systems were far beyond the capabilities of anything the mercenaries had in their arsenal. Thorne's elite soldiers, skilled in everything from ground warfare to space combat, had no answers for the Juggernaut. Their advanced weapon systems, designed to take down starships and fortresses, barely scratched the surface of the machine's defenses. As the Juggernaut continued its assault on the mercenaries, Thorne began to realize that this was no ordinary conflict. He had faced superior forces before, he had fought wars where he was outnumbered or outgunned. But this was different. The Juggernaut wasn't just a weapon, it was a game-changer. It shifted the balance of power in ways he hadn't even begun to consider. Thorne was no stranger to defeat, but this was a new kind of enemy. It was a machine, but it wasn't like anything the galaxy had ever seen. It didn't just take orders. It made decisions based on its own judgment, and its judgment was far more accurate and deadly than anything a human could come up with. What was most disconcerting to Thorne was the machine's ability to adapt to every move his forces made. The mercenaries had always prided themselves on their tactical superiority, but against the Juggernaut, their strategies were obsolete. The machine was already one step ahead. To make matters worse, the mercenaries' morale was starting to crack. It wasn't just the resistance fighters who were beginning to lose hope, Thorne's own men were growing anxious. They had signed up for a job, a contract, but no one had told them they would be facing a machine that seemed impervious to everything they had at their disposal. The stories of mercenaries who had engaged with the Juggernaut and never returned began to spread, sowing doubt and fear among the ranks. Even the most battle-hardened soldiers were starting to question the mission, and whispers of defection began to circulate. The Juggernaut's presence wasn't just a military threat, it was a psychological one. The mercenaries, who had once been known for their unshakable confidence, were now rattled. They had expected to bring an end to the rebellion quickly and decisively, but now they were fighting not just against an enemy, but against a force they couldn't comprehend. The fear was palpable. Thorne knew that if he didn't act fast, his army would collapse under the weight of their own uncertainty. At the same time, the resistance had found new hope. With the Juggernaut on their side, they began to rally. What had been a losing battle now looked winnable. The mere presence of the Juggernaut had changed the tides of war. The resistance fighters, inspired by the machine's arrival, began to push back harder than ever. They no longer saw themselves as a small, doomed force. They saw themselves as a legitimate challenge to the Empire's dominance. The Juggernaut had become more than just a weapon, it was a symbol of defiance. Thorne knew he needed to make a decision. The resistance was no longer something to be crushed with brute force. They were now an organized, formidable force, buoyed by the power of the Juggernaut. His mercenaries, despite their reputation and skill, were faltering in the face of this new reality. The longer the war dragged on, the more his forces would suffer. Thorne's options were dwindling, and his usual resolve began to erode. If he didn't act fast, he would lose everything. As the mercenaries regrouped and prepared for their next move, Thorne found himself in unfamiliar territory. The resistance had given him more than just a fight, it had given him a challenge that he couldn't solve with force alone. His usual tactics, his overwhelming firepower, were no match for the Juggernaut. And for the first time in his career, Thorne was unsure of his next step. The battle had shifted in ways he couldn't control, and the outcome was no longer certain. The Juggernaut had proven that it was not just a weapon, but a force that could alter the entire course of the war. Thorne's once unshakable confidence was now replaced with a growing sense of doubt. And as the Juggernaut continued to carve a path through his forces, Thorne knew that he was up against something far beyond his expertise. He was no longer just fighting a rebellion. He was fighting a revolution. The Empire's military superiority was no longer unquestionable. As the Juggernaut continued to dismantle the mercenaries' operations on Erythra X9, it became evident that the Resistance's survival was no longer a matter of mere hope. It was a strategic shift in galactic power. The mercenaries, despite their professional reputation, could no longer withstand the relentless, methodical destruction brought by the Juggernaut. Each battle they fought with it only reinforced the overwhelming realization: their existing tactics and resources were obsolete. The Empire had underestimated the significance of Earth's intervention. They had presumed that their mercenaries, powerful and well-trained as they were, would be more than enough to squash the resistance. But the Juggernaut was not a force they had prepared for. It was not just another machine, it was the embodiment of a new kind of warfare, one that had moved beyond mere firepower. In this shifting landscape, the role of Thorne, once a formidable commander of the mercenary army, began to diminish. His experience, his ability to read the battlefield, and his knack for outsmarting his enemies were no longer sufficient to counter the Juggernaut's unpredictability. The machine adapted to every move his forces made, while his soldiers grew more and more demoralized. What had once been an army that prided itself on its ability to outlast and overwhelm its opponents was now a group of men who were unsure whether they could even survive another confrontation with Earth's weapon. For Thorne, this was a bitter pill to swallow. He had led many campaigns across the galaxy, always emerging victorious, always in control of the situation. But this time, control had slipped away from him, and he was left scrambling, unsure of how to respond. The Empire's leadership had expected him to handle the insurgency, but they had underestimated what Earth had put into play. The Juggernaut was more than just a tool for battle, it was a symbol of a new power emerging in the galaxy. Earth was no longer a backwater planet on the fringes of galactic politics. It had entered the fray with a weapon that not only challenged the Empire's might but also signaled to other systems that the balance of power was shifting. The stakes were higher now. Thorne's defeat, while personal, carried broader implications for the Empire. If he failed to defeat the Resistance and its new powerful ally, the Juggernaut, the galaxy would see Earth as a legitimate contender for power. It could spark rebellions across systems that had previously fallen under the Empire's control. The fear of Earth's growing influence was palpable. Thorne understood the gravity of his situation. He wasn't just fighting to secure control of Erythra X9. He was fighting to prevent the destabilization of the entire Empire's dominance in the galaxy. Meanwhile, the Juggernaut had begun to reshape the battlefield in ways that defied conventional warfare. It was more than just a weapon, it was a catalyst. As it moved across the battlefield, decimating enemy fortifications, the resistance gained strength. The morale of the insurgents skyrocketed with every strike the Juggernaut made. They saw it not just as a machine, but as a beacon of hope. To them, it symbolized Earth's commitment to their cause. No longer were they fighting for survival, they were fighting for victory, and they now had the means to achieve it. This was a crucial turning point. The Juggernaut's actions had ignited a fire in the hearts of the resistance fighters. They began coordinating their efforts with a level of precision that had been absent in the previous weeks. The machine, though a symbol, was also a practical asset. Its firepower and tactical intelligence allowed the resistance to reclaim territory that had once seemed lost. The Empire's once imposing grip on Erythra X9 had loosened, and for the first time, Thorne realized that the tables were not just turning, they were about to break entirely. But as the resistance gained ground, Thorne scrambled to reassert control. He knew the only way to counter the Juggernaut was with something more powerful, something that could match it in scale, intelligence, and firepower. His first thought was to bring in reinforcements, additional mercenary forces from nearby systems, but that would take time. And time was something Thorne didn't have. Every day that passed, more territory slipped from his grasp. The resistance was emboldened, their movements more coordinated, and their attacks more strategic. Thorne couldn't afford to wait for backup. He needed to act now, and he needed to find a way to neutralize the Juggernaut. His second option was a more direct, more dangerous one. Thorne had heard rumors of a weapon, even more powerful than the Juggernaut, buried deep within the Empire's classified archives. It was a prototype, an experimental weapon, a machine that could surpass even the Juggernaut's capabilities. If he could access it, he might stand a chance. But the weapon was untested, and there was no guarantee it would work. Thorne knew that deploying such a weapon was a last resort. If it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic, not only for him but for the entire Empire. As Thorne weighed his options, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of panic within his ranks. His soldiers were no longer the disciplined, ruthless mercenaries they had once been. The fear that had taken root was contagious. It spread like wildfire through the ranks, and even the most hardened soldiers were beginning to question their orders. Thorne had always been able to command respect and instill confidence in his men, but now that confidence was faltering. Even the most loyal of his mercenaries were starting to show signs of doubt. The Resistance's victory seemed inevitable now. They had become an unstoppable force, and with the Juggernaut at their side, they were no longer simply defending, they were fighting for a cause, for a future. The rebellion was no longer a fleeting attempt to resist, it was a legitimate movement that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. Thorne was watching not just the collapse of his forces but the collapse of the Empire's dominance. He could feel the momentum slipping away from him. The Juggernaut was more than just a weapon now, it had become a rallying cry. The mercenaries were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted. And no amount of reinforcements or secret weapons could change the fact that the resistance, fueled by the Juggernaut's presence, had become an insurmountable challenge. As Thorne realized the full scope of his failure, he understood that the Empire's reach was no longer as limitless as it once seemed. The era of unchecked power was over. A new force had arrived, and it was reshaping the galaxy in its image. Earth's Juggernaut had proven that a single, unstoppable force could change the course of an entire war, and perhaps, the course of history. Thorne's plans had been reduced to dust, scattered by the relentless advance of the Juggernaut. Every strategy he had employed, every tactic he had mastered over the years, was now irrelevant. The Resistance no longer seemed like a collection of ragtag insurgents. They had transformed into a legitimate fighting force, one capable of not just surviving but conquering. And the Juggernaut had become their symbol of defiance. What had once been the backbone of the Empire's strength was now a source of embarrassment. The mercenaries had been outmaneuvered, outlasted, and now they were in full retreat. Thorne's pride, built on countless victories, was shattered. The weight of failure was heavy on him. His reputation had been built on the idea that no force was beyond his control, that no opposition was too strong to overcome. Yet here he was, on the verge of losing an entire war to a resistance movement bolstered by a single weapon, a weapon that seemed to think for itself. The Juggernaut had proven to be more than just a physical machine. It was a presence, a force of nature that reshaped the very dynamics of combat. Thorne's soldiers, once fearless, now found themselves paralyzed by doubt. The elite mercenaries had always been trained to fight the best, but they had never been prepared to face a machine that could outthink and outfight them at every turn. In a last-ditch effort to salvage the situation, Thorne made a desperate call to the Empire. He requested immediate reinforcements, but he knew deep down that it might already be too late. The Empire's leadership had been watching the situation unfold, and they were beginning to lose faith in Thorne's ability to turn things around. They had expected a swift victory, not the protracted conflict that was now dragging on. The Juggernaut was proving to be an insurmountable obstacle, and no amount of additional soldiers or weapons would change that fact. The idea of bringing in larger reinforcements had seemed like a logical choice initially, but the more Thorne thought about it, the more he realized that it was a futile solution. The Juggernaut was a game-changer, and it had already proven that even the most advanced technology the Empire had could not defeat it. Any reinforcements sent would face the same fate as his current forces, destroyed by an opponent that was simply too powerful, too adaptable. It was clear that the balance of power had shifted irreparably. The Juggernaut had proven that Earth was no longer the isolated planet the Empire had once dismissed. The Empire's reliance on overwhelming firepower and brute force was no longer enough. Thorne's entire approach to warfare, honed over years of conflict, had failed him. He had believed in the strength of numbers, the weight of superior weaponry, but the Juggernaut had shown him that strategy could evolve, that intelligence could become the ultimate weapon. Thorne could not ignore the growing momentum of the resistance any longer. What had started as a small uprising had turned into a full-blown revolution. And with the Juggernaut at the helm, the insurgents had taken control of key regions. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting to overthrow the Empire. And the Juggernaut was more than a weapon, it had become their symbol, their rallying point. The rebellion was gaining followers faster than Thorne could deal with, spreading like wildfire to other systems that had long been under the Empire's sway. The very notion of the Empire's invincibility was crumbling. In the wake of this realization, Thorne was forced to confront the fact that his position, his authority, his entire legacy was on the line. He was no longer the commander of an unstoppable force. He was the leader of a failing army. His options were narrowing by the hour. The longer the war dragged on, the more his forces faltered. Even if he could regroup, even if he could somehow gain new allies, the Juggernaut remained an insurmountable barrier. It was a weapon that couldn't be defeated through conventional means, a force that defied the Empire's tried-and-true methods of domination. The resistance, emboldened by the Juggernaut's success, pressed on with renewed vigor. They had turned the tide, and now they were on the offensive. Every inch of ground they gained was a blow to the Empire's prestige, and the longer the conflict stretched, the more they began to look like the victors. Thorne's forces, in contrast, were becoming increasingly disorganized. The mercenaries, once known for their precision and discipline, were now a broken and fractured group. Loyalty was slipping away as soldiers began to question whether the Empire could truly win this war. The cracks in his command were growing wider, and with them, the Empire's grip on Erythra X9. Desperation started to take hold of Thorne. He knew that if he didn't act swiftly, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for the entire Empire. He began considering extreme measures. He had always been willing to take risks, to make sacrifices for the greater good, but what he was now contemplating was beyond anything he had ever done before. If he failed in this final push, it could signal the end of the Empire's dominance. It was a terrifying thought, but it was one he couldn't avoid any longer. The Juggernaut had proven that Earth's forces were not to be underestimated, that their technology was far beyond anything the Empire had considered. What had begun as a rebellion was now a fight for survival, not just for the Resistance but for the entire galaxy's future. The balance of power was shifting, and the Juggernaut was at the center of it. It was the spearhead of a new era, one that left Thorne and his mercenaries struggling to keep up. In the final moments of the conflict, Thorne realized that the Juggernaut wasn't just a weapon, it was the symbol of something much larger. It represented a new order, a force that could not be controlled by brute force alone. The Empire's methods had failed because they had underestimated the value of adaptation, the power of intelligence, and the will of the people who fought for something more than just survival. Thorne had been fighting for the Empire's continued dominance, but in doing so, he had forgotten what truly mattered, what the Juggernaut represented. Now, it was clear that the Empire's time was over, and Earth's time had come. The Juggernaut had become more than just a tool of war, it had become the harbinger of change. And Thorne was left to watch as the Empire he had served for so long crumbled, unable to do anything to stop it.